Thank you, Onur, for that introduction, and thank you to SALT for inviting me tonight, and in particular to Meriç Onur for organizing tonight's talk. I'm going to be presenting some research in progress from a new book that I'm writing, and I'm very thankful to you for the opportunity to do that tonight. Now, before I begin, I just want to emphasize I have no background in Turkey or in Turkish studies. I've visited here maybe 6 or 7 times in the last 5 years, but my research focus is actually on urban infrastructure. Especially airports and how they're designed and how they operate across different cultural contexts. And that's the subject of a book that I published last year called Airport Urbanism. The book looks at the development of airport infrastructure in 5 cities in China and Southeast Asia over the last 30 years. And in particular at how airports changed the social and spatial structure of those cities. I'm now shifting the focus of my research to this part of the world. That's why I'm here tonight as a visitor, to ask for your advice and for your insights. So I would say you're the real experts, and I would be grateful to you for your feedback. Airport infrastructure is a very complicated topic. It's often so politicized that it's difficult to discuss its merits from the perspective of urban planning and design. Most discussions about airports concentrate on issues of political patronage and on the negative environmental impact of large-scale megaprojects, and that's true whether we're talking about here in Istanbul or really in most cities around the world. These are extremely important questions that need to be discussed through an open dialogue. Countries where they are not discussed openly, and China, for example, where I've done a lot of work, often end up with infrastructure projects that don't accomplish any of their intended goals. So I encourage you to continue discussing these very critical issues here. But what I'd like to do tonight is introduce some themes that I came across while doing research at Istanbul's new airport over the past year and at the authority that will build and operate it called İGA. I'd like to draw your attention to these themes because they're very important for the future of urban development and architectural production here in Istanbul, and because I think that until now, most of these themes have been largely overlooked. So I'm going to start briefly by introducing 2 big picture issues that are driving the redevelopment of Istanbul's airport infrastructure, and then look at how broader considerations are affecting changes in the planning and design of Istanbul, and examine what the social, spatial, and aesthetic implications are for the future of the city as a whole. So the first big issue is the reorganization of the global aviation system, the role that Turkey plays in that. And what we're looking at here is basically a chart of air traffic, passenger air traffic over the last 40 years. And what you're seeing is that there's been an 8-fold increase since about the mid-1970s. And the issue is not just a numerical one, but it's also a geographic one. So until the 1990s, most of the air traffic in the world was concentrated in North America and Europe. But over the last 20 years, there's been a major shift towards Asia and towards Africa. And with that, we've seen the emergence of Middle Eastern hubs like Doha and Dubai. And the idea here is that the Middle East can take advantage of its geographic position to emerge as a hub of global air traffic. So where does Istanbul fit in with that? Well, for the past decade or so, Turkey has been engaging with what we might call aerial diplomacy through its national carrier, Turkish Airlines. And during that time, Turkish Airlines expanded its fleet by a factor of 5. It tripled the number of destinations served by its 300 airplanes. So this has been a huge expansion with the idea to position Istanbul to take advantage of growing air traffic between Europe and Asia. And in that sense, it's part of a larger trend where Turkey is trying to replicate some of the economic development strategies of Gulf states like the UAE and Qatar. It's also a way to promote Turkish business interests in parts of the world that are bypassed by global trade routes. That includes the capitals of relatively inaccessible African countries and also secondary cities in the Middle East and former Soviet bloc that aren't typically served by international airlines. Oops, sorry. Through this expansion policy, the number of passengers who've been passing through Istanbul's 2 airports increased from about 12 million in 2003 to 90 million in 2015. And during many of those years, both Ataturk and Sabiha Gökçen airports were the fastest growing airports in the world. So that's the explanation that I've been given many times for why Istanbul needs a new airport and why Ataturk needs to be closed. Personally, I don't believe that that's true. Based on about a dozen conversations with expert planners and engineers, I think Ataturk and Sabiha Gökçen could easily be expanded. But the emergence of a narrative that insists that it's essential to build this new airport is a nice transition into the second big picture issue that's going on, not just here in Istanbul, but in cities around the world, where a new generation of greenfield airport projects are being used to drive larger infrastructure-led urban development plans. So what we're looking at here is a couple pictures of Beijing, which right now is also building a second hub airport, which will open likely in 2019. The airport is being built as part of a larger strategy to address pollution and manage population growth in the inner city by creating satellite cities in the surrounding province of Hubei. To do this, they're relocating government ministries and creating infrastructure to make it more attractive to live on the outskirts. Daxing Airport, designed by Zaha Hadid and NACO, is being used as an anchor for one of these new satellite cities. This Daxing is in the southwest of the city. It's a place where a lot of migrant workers are living, and they're commuting 2 hours or more into the inner city every day. And the idea is to bring some of the jobs out to them so that doesn't take place quite so much. We also see this strategy in Sydney, where the population has been growing by about more than 20% in the last few years, in the last decade, excuse me, mainly due to immigration from Asia, from the Mediterranean and the Middle East. And the issue in Sydney is everyone wants to live on the coast. But the towns on the coast do not have the capacity to absorb these many newcomers. And so the idea is to develop what's called the Western Sydney Metropolis that's centered around a new airport called Badgerys Creek, which will serve as a structuring device for the next major wave of Sydney's urban growth. And we also see it in Mexico City. This is a project designed by Fernando Romero together with Foster and Partners, where the new airport is addressing a lot of the same issues that I just outlined. So to sum up, all of these airports are being built with two goals in mind. On the one hand, they're trying to increase capacity in countries where passenger figures are set to grow for the foreseeable future. And at the same time, these greenfield projects double as a strategy for large-scale urban development on the ground. With thoughtful planning, these two goals, increasing air capacity and expanding the city, can be complementary. But places like Beijing, like Sydney, Mexico City, and also Istanbul run the risk of making big mistakes early on in the design process that can lead to enormous social, financial, and environmental costs further down the line. In a best-case scenario, these greenfield projects will generate dynamic new airport hubs and will bring jobs, services, and amenities to poorer and peripheral parts of the urban region. In a worst-case scenario, they risk becoming white elephants, isolated on the urban fringe, unpopular among airlines and their customers, and eating up vast sums of public and private money that could have been better spent elsewhere. Now, before continuing, it might be helpful to look at some of the details of the project here in Istanbul. And I just want to throw out some statistics, which many of you probably already know. It's designed to be one of the largest airports in the world. It's the largest construction project in the history of the Turkish Republic, and it's currently one of the largest construction sites in the world. The site occupies about 76 square kilometers of land that's administered directly by the airport authority DHMI. So by comparison, that's an area about 9 times the size of Beyoğlu. The first phase of the project includes a terminal building that's 1.3 million square meters in size, which is just a massive scale, and this is what it looked like when I visited it yesterday. One of the biggest challenges, in my view, is that the terminal is too big. For example, passengers who are transferring from an international flight to a domestic one will need to walk for almost 2 kilometers between gates. So the distances are too long, and moving forward, this is one of the major challenges that the airport authority needs to address. The project will also ultimately encompass 6 runways and include a very large airport city, which we'll look at a bit later. And in the long run, the aim is to turn the airport into kind of an intermodal hub that includes a high-speed rail line with a connection to Ankara and a seaport designed to supply natural gas from Russia. But already now, the airport is having a tremendous impact on the social and spatial reorganization of Istanbul. And I'd like to highlight two larger themes here. The first is a major shift in architectural production through the introduction of design and planning expertise from abroad, and especially from East Asia and the Gulf states. The second theme is the impact that the airport is having on Istanbul's urban structure and on urban development and communities around the airport. So much of the airport's design, engineering, and operational knowledge has been produced by foreigners. British engineers, Norwegian architects, Dutch traffic analysts, American urban designers. And there's a very long history here in Turkey of American and European experts bringing technical and architectural knowledge to Turkey. But actually today a lot of that is coming from East and Southeast Asia. So any visit to IGA headquarters begins or ends with a demonstration of an intricate model of the new airport terminal, which is displayed in the reception area. And one switch illuminates the terminal's forecourt, and another one lowers and raises its various components to reveal the interior design of the departure and arrivals halls. And I wanted to meet the firm that designed it, and it is made in Turkey, but it is produced by a Hong Kong/UAE firm with imported modeling technology. And after several visits, I wanted to know about who were the skilled construction laborers who were building this. And it turns out that, particularly for the truck drivers, quite a lot of them are Vietnamese. And when I asked why, I was told that they're cheaper, they're better trained, and they're easier to manage than Turkish workers. And I also wanted to know a little bit about operations. So the consortium of construction firms who is building the new airport, they have a lot of very good experience with building projects, but less experience with operating airports, which is a very specific and complex task. And because of that, they know that at this particular moment, about a year before the airport opens, it's really important to shift the focus from construction to operations. And one of the most important processes today is something known in the industry as ORAT, or Operational Readiness and Airport Transfer. And actually, the advisors for this come from the Incheon Airport Authority in South Korea. Also, a lot of the Turkish staff members who have firsthand experience about how to design and operate a new airport got that knowledge by working together with an Indian infrastructure firm called GMR and the state-owned airport authority of Malaysia. So GMR and Malaysia Airports were hired in the early 2000s to convert a military airfield into what later became Sabiha Gökçen. And I spoke to the Malaysian team there, and essentially a lot of that knowledge is now being transferred from Kuala Lumpur via Sabiha Gökçen to the new airport. So why does this all matter? The big picture is maybe a larger process of inter-Asian urbanization, where the know-how at various levels, from semi-skilled labor to terminal design to representational and managerial strategies, come from Vietnam, Malaysia, South Korea, Hong Kong, and the UAE. And I think we need to reflect on what this means more broadly for the implications for design knowledge and how projects here in Istanbul are being produced. But beyond these shifts in design and production, and maybe more interesting for the audience here, I think it's important to consider the impact that this new airport will have on the urban development of Istanbul. So as I mentioned earlier, building this new airport hub doubles as a strategy of urban expansion. And with that, the task of building an airport goes far beyond just providing air transport, and it comes to encompass a much broader range of urban and planning and design ambitions. In my experience doing interviews here, but really all over the world, this poses a real challenge for transport planners who aren't trained to do that kind of thing. In Istanbul, we can observe three modes of infrastructure-led urbanization around the airport, or what we might call airport urbanism. A master-planned airport city, a variety of local improvement programs, which we might call public-private village development, and spontaneous growth driven both by migration and by real estate speculation. So I'm just going to show a couple images of the airport city. It was designed by the Atlanta office of Perkins and Will. It's intended to include retail, hotels, hospitals, schools, and university campuses. There are two main sections that are connected by a new metro line, and I believe I have, so on the upper left, this is the one, top left, this is the airport city and directly next to the terminal, and lower right a little bit further to the east. And when I spoke to the director of the airport city, he told me that the airport forecourt, what they were aiming for was to create something like Bomonti Ada. And he conceived of the eastern zone as kind of an extension or connector between the airport and Göktürk, sort of a transitional zone providing services for both passengers and local residents. But one of the challenges is housing. This is government land, so it can't be developed for long-term residential projects. And remember, the land is under the stewardship of the State Airport Authority, DHMI, so technically this is going to revert to the government in 25 years. So instead, the airport is considering building temporary housing like serviced apartments for flight crews and dormitories for students. So, this points to two things. First, there's been a programmatic expansion of airport projects that's happening all over the world right now as airports move beyond just providing air transport and become major real estate developers on the ground. And in the particular case of Istanbul, it reveals how land transfers by state-level ministries both accelerate and limit urban development. And what I mean by that is it accelerates it because there's no need to consult with the Istanbul greater municipality or local municipalities, but because this remains state land, it forecloses certain development possibilities, especially housing. As I've written about on my website, the challenge for any airport city project is to engage with existing site conditions and really to manage your expectations about what realistically can be achieved. And typically we do that through a more incremental approach that engages with the needs and desires of your passengers, of local residents, and also the local business community. The second form of airport urbanism is what we might call public-private village development. And what do I mean by that? Well, IGA has a very large social and environmental management team with about 30 staff members, and part of their remit is to support local communities through social welfare and economic development. So they're doing things like building health centers and libraries, they're renovating schools, and they're also providing microcredits to small and medium enterprises. Some of these transactions are done cooperatively, where the local municipality supplies the land and IGA does the construction. After I visited about half a dozen of these projects, it really struck me that IGA's tasks more closely resemble that of a public sector urban planning agency rather than those of a typical CSR department. And in many of these villages, they're providing basic services like healthcare and education for the very first time. I had the chance to meet with the principal of a school in one of the villages near the airport, and I asked him, I think it's great that the new airport is helping you out and helping out these local communities, but shouldn't the government be doing this? Isn't the government responsible for basic services like health and education? And he shrugged his shoulder and he said, of course the state should be doing this, but they're not. For each item that I request, I have to fill out dozens and dozens of forms, and the process will take 6 months, maybe a year. It's an endless procedure. I'm very busy running the school, and I just don't have time for that. But if I ask the airport, they say yes, and the work gets done. In one village, this is Akpinar on the eastern side of the airport site, the IGA office is co-located with that of the local muhtar. So maybe it's not surprising that we see both the village heads and local officials coming to IGA, not just to ask for money to support local development, but also for advice on how to deal with the greater Istanbul municipality, who are trying to expropriate a lot of village land, and also land along coastlines and major roadways. And the reasons for this are unclear. These undefined land use rights are leading to a permanent sense of instability among the local populations, and they're asking IGA to help them. So the big picture of all these developments that I've outlined is the kind of blurring of the lines between the responsibilities of the public and the private sector. So the government is giving taxpayer money to a private consortium to build the airport, but the airport in turn is expected to build schools and hospitals in the region and also to advocate for the villagers' interests. So what I've observed is maybe the start of something where maybe an airport authority begins to operate a bit more like a municipality. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the airport is being built in an area that has been subjected to frequent shifts in population. Almost all the residents in the 9 villages around the airport can trace their own or their parents' origin to somewhere else. Historically, a lot of these people came from Greece and the Balkans. More recently, there's been a lot of migration from eastern Anatolia, also refugees from Syria. And one of the cheapest places to live in Istanbul, in the Istanbul region, is in the communities around the airport. And I'm showing you a map here that was developed at the Istanbul Studies Center at Kadir Has University by Murat Güvenç and Murat Tülek, and they managed to collect a large amount of land valuation data, and basically you can see that the dark blue parts are basically the cheap parts of the city. And we can see Arnavutköy, which is up there in the northwest where the airport is by far one of the cheapest. And getting back to this idea of migration, it's striking how the construction of the new airport is reigniting a lot of these migratory processes. So in Akpinar, the village that I just mentioned, there were about 1,100 residents before the airport started to be built. But the airport authority and its subcontractors built a very large temporary camp designed to house 15,000 workers who come from the Black Sea, from Georgia, from Pakistan, and from Vietnam. I visited the camp. It's very clean. Everything is right up to code. It's segregated by sex, and it's further subdivided into modular dwellings for white and blue-collar workers. The challenge, though, is the capacity problems that this brings for the village. Obviously, if you put 15,000 workers somewhere, almost all of whom are men, they're going to be looking for recreation, but there's not enough space and there are very limited transport options. This led to friction with the villagers, and so IGA responded by adding new bus lines and also hiring people from the local community to police the workers. So, I think that the takeaway here is that these airport projects that are designed to abet mobility at a global scale in themselves are fueling migration around them. Now, when you talk to government officials, they say, well, there's no need to plan for these communities, meaning the construction workers, because these populations are temporary. But I would counter that active construction will continue for the next decade, and temporary migrant communities have this funny way of becoming permanent. So lastly, I'd like to take a quick look at the impact that the airport is having on the adjacent municipality of Arnavutköy, where it's triggering a wave of speculative real estate development. This is one of the fastest growing parts of the city. In the last decade, its population grew by about 50% to more than 250,000 people. This is a peri-urban landscape with shepherds herding flocks of cows and sheep, thousands of earth-moving trucks, and half-built mosques. A very prominent feature of the roads leading to and from the new airport are these kind of slapdash real estate offices that cluster around the village center. Some of them are housed in little more than shacks, and each of them feature these kind of poorly photoshopped images of Istanbul's infrastructure plans. And a common joke that I heard here a couple times is that if you walk down the street in Arnavutköy and you ask someone who owns a particular building or piece of land, by the end of the day, you're probably going to end up owning that particular building or land yourself. And I spoke to the vice mayor for urban development and also the municipality's real estate director, and what struck me is that there's not a lot of formal coordination between the airport and this local municipality, and in particular that Arnavutköy doesn't seem to have a master plan or a real strategy moving forward for what it's going to mean to be the neighbor of one of the world's largest airports. So moving forward, I think there's a lot of opportunities for improvement in terms of coming up with joint strategies and governance models that could maybe make sure that the airport and the communities around them are growing together for mutual benefit. So what? To sum up, tonight we looked at two broader issues. On the one hand, the shift in design and production of infrastructure projects, especially through the transfer of ideas from Asia and the Gulf states. And on the other hand, we talked about how the airport is driving urbanization in the city's northwestern frontier through a variety of planned and unplanned forms of development. And I'd like to conclude by asking what the broader implications are for all of this for the future of Istanbul as a whole. And my goal here is to stimulate a discussion of how the reordering of your airport infrastructure will affect the overall spatial organization of your city. I asked one airport engineer what would happen by moving the city's main airport from Ataturk to İGA. And this person answered to me, it's like taking a stomach and putting it somewhere else in the body. You have to reorder your digestive system and your body has to get used to it somehow. Now, there are a couple of different dimensions to that. I'm not sure if I like the comparison of airport and stomach, but anyway, there are a couple different dimensions to that. Airports are one of the largest centers of employment in any city, and at this scale, you're talking about moving at least 100,000 jobs to a very far away part of the city. Where are these employees going to live, and do the developments around the airport that I've outlined engage with their future needs? Right now, to be honest, based on what people that I've talked to, this doesn't seem to be a very desirable place to live. And at the same time, this area is functioning as an affordable place for new migrants to get settled and get on their feet in Istanbul. And so how can we give them more security in terms of land tenure so that they feel invested in the local community and know that they will be able to stay and be part of a new city, really? Another big question is, how will the airport be connected to the city? And how will people move back and forth? And what you're seeing here is some recent photos of one of the new stations that is being built on a high-speed or limited stop metro line between the airport that will end at Gayrettepe. There is a plan for this line, but the completion date at this point is unclear. And it's super important that that happen, if not when the airport opens, then at least very, very soon afterwards, or else there's going to be a lot of challenges. But that also means that this new airport station in town at Gayrettepe would become the first impression for millions of people when they come to Istanbul for the first time. And Gayrettepe would become the city's main point of interconnection between local traffic and global flows. So in Hong Kong, where I live, when Hong Kong built a new airport at the end of the 1990s and closed its old one, they also built an entire new urban district in the city center focused on this new airport train station, and it essentially became the new central business district. So a question, for the architects, the urban planners in the audience is, how do you want to program that new urban interface between the airport and the city? And lastly is the question of the future of Ataturk Airport, which remains unclear. It's supposed to close, but I suspect that it won't entirely. It may stay open for limited operations like private jets, and it could very well over the years turn into something like London City Airport, if you've been there. Either way, it will have a greatly diminished role compared to what it does now. The city has developed around Ataturk Airport for more than 40 years, and the impact of moving it will be felt in many different places. So a question is, how do you want to redevelop the airport site, and how will the desirability of that highway corridor leading to the current airport be affected by its closure? So all of these are questions that are essential to think about right now to understand how Istanbul's urban structure will change as a result of the new airport, and also to start thinking about what the opportunities are for architects and urban planners to shape that process. Now, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments during the Q&A.